Hi, it's good to be with you again. Uh, just want to encourage us to go ahead and read the passage in Matthew before we discuss it. It's Matthew 27, 57 through 66, Matthew 28, 11 through 15. If you could just take a minute to read that, that would be great. Thanks. The old hymn writer says, "You ask me how I know he lives? He lives inside my heart." And this is the testimony of most Christians, isn't it? That Jesus is alive because we know him personally. We know that he's alive. We've experienced him, right? Now, for some of our skeptical friends, our personal experience isn't enough for them. Fortunately, God wants us to know, and he wants us to know that our experience is true, first of all, but he also wants our skeptical friends to know that this is really true, that this really did happen. And so the burial story and the guard story is powerful background evidence. And just a little bit of the evidence, there's a lot of evidence, but this is powerful background evidence that this is really true, that Jesus really rose again from the dead. Well, how so? Well, first of all, the burial story, we know it's not just Matthew who said that Joseph of Arimathea buried Jesus, but all four gospel accounts tell us that Jesus was buried by Joseph of Arimathea. Now, why is that important? Because when you get two separate ancient historical accounts of an event happening, historians go, wow, this must have really happened. We don't have just two stories of Joseph of Arimathea burying Jesus. We have four independent stories of this happening. So historians look at this and they go, this is really powerful evidence. Joseph of Arimathea must have buried him. But this is kind of strange also. Another reason why the evidence is so powerful is that the question is almost glaring. How come Jesus' family and his friends didn't bury him? Why would a member of the hated Jewish Sanhedrin be the one burying Jesus? I mean, this is the ruling group of Jewish leaders who condemned Jesus to be crucified, and one of their own number is the guy who goes to bury him. So that is another reason why historians look at this and they go, wow, this is so unlikely to be made up. This has to be true. And so this is really important. And why so? Why is it important that Joseph buried him? Well, it's really important because when the Christians begin to proclaim right there in Jerusalem, not somewhere far in distant Greece somewhere, but right there in Jerusalem, they began proclaiming, just right next to where Jesus had been crucified and buried, they start proclaiming that Jesus has risen from the dead. Very quickly, the Jewish leaders would have wanted to verify this. They could have talked to Joseph of Arimathea. He could have showed them, yep, I buried him right here. This is where he's buried. This is my tomb. This is where I buried him. And what would they have seen? Well, if Jesus hadn't risen from the dead, they would have seen a full tomb. But we don't see any evidence of the Jews or anyone saying, what are you guys talking about? The tomb is full. Jesus is still buried in there. Even if the body had been badly decomposed, the Christians would have been on the defensive saying, no, that's not really Jesus' body. But the Jews would have been saying, these guys are drunk, they're nuts, they're crazy, the tomb's full. What are they talking about? One of our own guys buried him. We know that's where he is, right? But we don't see any evidence of this. This is not what happened, is it? That leads us to the next point, the guard story. Now, Matthew is the only gospel writer who talks about this strange story of a Roman guard guarding Jesus' tomb. Now, some skeptics have seized on that, and they've said, okay, see, only Matthew writes about this, so this is probably all just made up, because Matthew's the only guy who says anything about it. We don't see the other gospels writers writing about this. But you know what? Even if we want to play around with the skeptic and say, okay, yeah, go ahead. We'll go along with your hypothetical. We'll say, hypothetically speaking, yeah, this never really happened. You know what? It's totally irrelevant. Even if Matthew made up the story, the evidence is still powerful. Well, why is that? It's because of this reason. Why is it that Matthew feels compelled to tell this story? He feels compelled to tell this story because the Jews are walking around saying the disciples stole the body. So he tells this story to refute the Jewish story that was circulating around there that the disciples had stolen the body. And obviously this must have been a story that was circulating in Jerusalem in that day. Why else would Matthew feel compelled to talk about it if it wasn't being talked about? So clearly this is what the Jews were saying, that the disciples had stolen Jesus' body. Now, this is really, really important. This points powerfully to the fact that the tomb is empty, because you've got enemies agreeing on the same thing. The tomb is empty. Just giving different explanations, that's all. But they're agreeing the tomb is actually empty. When you get enemies agreeing in a court of law or in historical testimony that an event really happened, historians tell us, man, this is like really golden. We know that this is actually what happened. So this is really, really powerful evidence that in fact the tomb was empty. And then we see women discovering the tomb. I mean, that's even more hard to believe. Women weren't considered reliable witnesses. You know, the bottom line is, brethren, if the story were made up, that would have meant the disciples were lying, and we know that they didn't lie because they were willing to die for what they believed. This is just a little bit of the snippet of the evidence, brethren. The bottom line is Jesus really is alive. There's tons and tons of evidence about this. So we can know with great confidence, my friend, he is alive. He is risen. He's risen indeed. Have a great